He stood at the PX window just after dawn, coffee cooling in his hand, while the flag rope clinked outside. They'd mocked his silence all week, pressed him to admit he'd ruined the town's precious plane, as if caution were a crime. Then he reached into his pocket, the canteen cup tag still warm from his palm, and looked toward the hangar where truth hummed louder than any engine. Quiet men leave echoes, too. The doors had been open since dawn, but no one was looking at the exhibits. They were looking at the plane. The silver body of the old trainer sat heavy and silent under the skylight, its propeller locked mid-turn, the scent of oil and solvent still hanging in the air. Frank Leary stood beside it in his pressed khakis cap tucked under one arm. For the first time in 40 years, the retired pilot didn't have a flight schedule, a checklist, or an answer. He felt the stares more than he saw them, neighbors, old mechanics, councilmen who'd signed off on the restoration budget. Across the hangar, a young reporter whispered something to her cameraman, the flash from her lens catching the polished cowling. 8 months of fundraising, someone muttered near the ticket stand, and he grounds it on dedication day. Frank didn't move. The floor under his boots was still cool from the morning shade, but the heat from the crowd was rising. Mayor Nolan's voice cut through the chatter, firm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not make a scene. Mr. Leary can explain himself." Heads turned toward him like weather vanes. Frank's throat tightened. The explanation was sitting just inches from him, a set of wrenches, a maintenance log, and a decision that had saved more lives than anyone here would believe. But the truth sounded too small for this room. He cost this town 80 grand, and his badge, Nolan continued. "You all saw the notice. That did it." The murmurs thickened into judgment. To them, he was the man who broke their plane, the man who'd spoiled a show meant to remind the county of pride and progress. Frank lifted his eyes to the fuselage, its reflection running in the hangar's dull concrete like a silver scar. The sound of the crowd faded into a single hum, just the fans spinning high above, stirring warm air that smelled of metal and memory. He wanted to tell them the crack he'd found wasn't just in aluminum. It was in the way things were done. Skip a test rush, a flight. Hope the old man's instincts were wrong. Instead, he said nothing. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve near the rope line. "Mom, why isn't the pilot talking?" The question cut cleaner than the mayor's words. Frank looked down, catching the faint reflection of his face in the wrench beside him. His hand reached for it out of habit. The tool was older than half the crowd, its handle worn smooth one corner, nicked from a job in Saigon long ago. His thumb found that nick, the way some men found a prayer bead. He could fix machines, never rumors. The mayor was still talking, promising a new inspection, an apology to the donors, a proper flight before the 4th of July. Frank let the words drift past him the same way he used to let crosswinds slip under the wing before adjusting trim. Out beyond the hangar doors, sunlight flared across the tarmac, and the flag beside the museum gate snapped once in the wind. For a moment, he almost heard the sound of engines overhead, Piper Cubs maybe, or ghosts from another air show long gone. If they wanted a villain, he'd let them have one for now. The proof was in the wrench in the bolt he hadn't tightened, in the quiet math of what could have happened if he'd looked the other way. He set the wrench down on the wing and turned toward the open light. The hum of the fans filled the silence. He left behind a steady rhythm, counting seconds that felt heavier than any noise the crowd could make. The meeting was held in the side hangar, a space that always smelled of burned coffee and floor wax. Folding chairs lined the concrete, each one occupied by a face that had known Frank for years, back when he flew crop dusters over Harrison County fields before the museum, before all this. The coffee urn hissed in the corner. Someone poured a cup too quickly, and the splash hit the paper tablecloth with a sound sharper than it should have been. A floorboard creaked under the weight of a councilman shifting his stance. No one spoke above a murmur. Mayor Nolan cleared his throat. "Mr. Leary, we're not here to shame you. We just want to understand what happened." Frank sat in the front row, hands folded around his cap. His wrench lay on the table in a sealed evidence bag, a bolt taped beside it like a captured crime. "You called it a hearing," he said quietly. "Feels like a trial." "It doesn't have to be one," the mayor replied. "But people deserve an explanation. The plane failed inspection, the dedication flight was canceled, and the press wants answers." Frank looked at the bag, at the small silver bolt he'd left deliberately loose. That bolt, he said, wasn't the failure. A ripple went through the room, half disbelief, half impatience. Frank Nolan said, "Trying for diplomacy. We all respect what you've done for the county, but grounding a display plane on opening day, that cost us donors and you know it." Frank lifted his head. "You think I don't know what things cost?" For a second there was only the low hum of the fan and the rattle of the urn cooling down. He wanted to explain about the fracture, the metal fatigue no one else had spotted, but the words would sound like excuses until someone saw it for themselves. Then from the back of the room a younger voice broke the stillness. "Maybe he saved the plane," said Evan Cole, the museum's new apprentice mechanic. He couldn't have been more than 21, his shirt sleeves rolled up, grease still under his nails. "You ever think about that?" Nolan frowned. "Son, you're out of order." Evan didn't sit. "You told me to run the test the night before the ceremony. Mr. Leary said the readings didn't look right, and he was right. That mount was running hot. If we'd flown enough—" The mayor's tone cracked like static. Evan hesitated, then sat. But the words hung there, suspended in the air like the smell of burnt coffee, undeniable and uncomfortable. Frank's gaze met the boy's. There was gratitude there, and also worry. The kind you feel when someone sticks their neck out for you in front of a crowd that wants a clean story. Sometimes, Evan said more softly, almost to himself, the right thing looks like failure. No one answered. The fan kept spinning overhead, groaning against its bearings. Frank thought of how engines did that too, how a vibration meant something inside was trying to warn you. Then Nolan reached up and flipped the fan's switch. The blades slowed, whining once before coasting to a stop. The silence thickened, pressing on every ear in the room. Frank exhaled. The still air felt heavier than before. Outside, a gust rattled the hangar's metal siding. It wasn't the weather. It was a sound like memory shifting in its seat. And for the first time that morning, Frank realized something simple, something terrifying in its quiet way. The noise wasn't from the engine. The night before the dedication, the hangar smelled like rain and hot oil. A single bulb hung above Frank's workbench, throwing a narrow stripe of light across the concrete floor. The radio on the shelf whispered a late-night forecast. Clear skies, gentle crosswinds, perfect for flying. He almost smiled at the word perfect. Machines were never perfect. They were only honest. They told the truth in vibrations, in the color of exhaust, in the way metal spoke when you tapped it with a wrench. A drop of oil hit the pan below with a slow, steady rhythm. Somewhere in that sound was peace, the kind that had followed him through decades of maintenance shifts and pre-flight checks. He'd learned to listen harder when things seemed fine. Trouble liked to whisper first. He leaned under the belly of the plane flashlight balanced in his mouth. The beam caught the faint shimmer of fuel along the mount line. It wasn't much, just a hairline mark where there shouldn't have been one. He wiped it with a rag. The streak came back. Frank frowned. He switched off the radio, letting the silence settle around the ticking clock above the office door. Then he reached for his inspection mirror and angled it under the frame. There it was, a small crescent-shaped crack, clean as a blade's edge. If that mount failed under power, the line would shear and flood the engine bay with fuel. No warning, no second chance. He sat back on his heels, feeling the weight of years press through the soles of his boots. The procedures said he should tag it, file a maintenance report, and wait for authorization. But the dedication flight was scheduled for sunrise, and the inspector wouldn't arrive until Monday. He looked toward the clipboard, hanging on the wall pages of signatures and stamps. Each one meant protection for the people who wrote them, not for the ones who flew. He was pinned by procedure, pinned by the rule that said paperwork mattered more than instinct. He ran a thumb along the crack again. It wasn't spreading yet, but metal didn't care about intentions. It cared about stress, fatigue, heat, and time, all the things you couldn't talk out of a job. Frank reached for his wrench. The handle felt cool and certain in his palm. A single turn could stop that plane from leaving the ground. One loose bolt just enough to fail inspection. The report would read improper torque, not prevented disaster. He'd take the reprimand. Better that than a memorial service for a show flight. He knelt again, breath slow, the way he used to steady himself before takeoff. The wrench clicked once. The sound echoed longer than it should have. He tested the mount, just enough movement to guarantee a fail. Then he wiped his hands, turned the flashlight off, and sat on the stool by the door. The clock ticked under the lamp, counting seconds that felt heavier with each one. In that quiet, he remembered a younger version of himself, sitting in a cockpit somewhere over the Pacific, listening to engines sing and hoping they would hold just a little longer. He'd promised himself back then that if he ever saw danger coming, he'd never look away from it, not even when it looked like failure. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the metal roof. He looked once more at the silver plane under the lamp glow, beautiful even in stillness. Tomorrow someone else would fly his mistake or his mercy. The airfield shimmered under the noon sun. The crowd packed tight along the rope line. The smell of fuel and cut grass mingled with the sweet varnish of the freshly polished wings. For the first time in weeks, Frank stood behind the barricade instead of beside the plane. Mayor Nolan had insisted on a public test. Transparency, he'd called it. If Mr. Leary believes the mount is safe now, the people deserve to see it fly. Evan Cole was already strapping into the cockpit. The boy's shoulders were squared, his jaw set in that brave, nervous way young pilots always had before their first takeoff in front of a crowd. Frank wanted to call out to say he didn't have to prove anything, but the words stayed behind his teeth. The engine coughed once, then came alive. Its propeller blurred into silver, the sound rippling across the field, low at first, then stronger. A throaty hum that made even the most skeptical spectators hush. The vibration ran through the ground, through the soles of their shoes, into Frank's chest. RPM steady. Evan's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, thin through the radio static. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane began to roll, tail lifting. The crowd clapped once, then stopped as a stutter shivered through the engine note. A tremor, small but sharp, passed down the fuselage. Frank's breath caught. He could hear it, feel it, the same pulse he'd heard that night before the flight. The same warning. "Cut it!" Frank shouted before he realized he'd spoken. Evan's voice broke through again. "Negative pressure on the fuel line. I'm throttling down." The engine sputtered once, then went silent. The propeller slowed, the field went utterly still. Even the birds over the hangar seemed to stop mid-air. Mechanics ran forward, waving smoke away as the plane rolled to a gentle stop at the far end of the runway. Evan climbed out unharmed, holding the rag he'd used to test the mount. In his other hand, he raised something small and jagged. The fractured fuel line split clean through. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The mayor froze, clipboard in hand, lips parting, but no sound coming out. Frank stepped closer, his voice carrying without needing a microphone. "I broke my own engine to bring everyone home." No one moved. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. The truth wasn't dramatic. It was plain and heavy and impossible to argue with. Evan walked the broken line to him. "You saved us before we ever left the ground." The mayor looked down at his clipboard, then slowly lowered it as the propeller wound to a stop. The only sound was the wind brushing against the hangar's metal siding, soft as a sigh. Frank reached out and set the cracked piece of fuel line on the wing beside the wrench that had started it all. He broke it so it wouldn't break them. The hangar smelled of fresh paint and warm metal again. For the first time in months, the sound inside wasn't argument, it was work. Hammers tapped in rhythm with the radio, the kind of steady beat that makes a place feel alive. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, throwing bright gold across the floor where dust and laughter mixed easily. Frank walked slowly down the row of tool benches, sleeves rolled the old patch on his overalls, catching a stray glint of light. The patch was nothing fancy, faded wings stitched years ago, but to him it felt heavier now, a quiet badge that didn't need ceremony. Evan stood on a ladder steadying the cowling as two mechanics bolted it in place. "Hold it a touch higher," Frank called, voice still gravel but lighter than it had been in weeks. "That's it. Don't force the line, let it settle where it wants to go." "Yes, sir," Evan said. Frank smiled. "Don't call me Sir Kid. I retired from that a long time ago." The boy grinned, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve already marked by grease. "Then, what do I call you?" "Just Frank'll do." The mayor was there too, in rolled-up shirt sleeves instead of his usual suit, pretending to look busy tightening a panel screw. A few photographers had shown up, but were keeping their distance, careful not to interrupt what was clearly a different kind of story now. Someone from the crowd of volunteers called out, "Hey, Frank, this new checklist, you mind if we keep it as policy?" He nodded. "It's not mine anymore. It's ours." They'd started calling it the Leary Safety Check, a list of pre-flight steps built from his notes. Evan's adjustments and the lessons learned the hard way. Each line carried a trace of humility, not pride. Inspect twice, assume nothing. Listen for what the engine isn't saying. Frank moved closer to the nose of the plane where Evan was aligning the final bolts. "You know, he said my father used to tell me every sound in a hangar means something. A rattle's a question, a hum's an answer. You just have to know which one you're hearing." Evan looked up. "And what's this one?" The older man listened for a moment, the gentle clack of tools, the radio crooning an old Glenn Miller tune, the rhythm of people working together. He nodded once. "That's a thank you." The mayor laughed under his breath. "Guess he finally fixed our attitude, too." The line drew a round of chuckles that rolled easily through the hangar. Even Frank laughed, shaking his head. "Don't push your luck, Nolan." They kept working until the sun slipped low and the light turned amber through the windows. Shadows stretched long across the concrete, and the day's chatter softened into quiet concentration. By evening, the plane gleamed like it had been waiting for forgiveness rather than restoration. The last panel slid into place with a satisfying click. Most of the volunteers drifted toward the door talking about supper plans, leaving the hangar to the crickets and the cooling metal. Frank stayed behind. He wasn't in a hurry. He never had been. The patch on his overalls brushed against the wing as he bent to tighten the final bolt. One last click echoed through the empty space, small, clean final. He sat for a while on the stool near his bench, watching the light fade until the shape of the plane was more memory than machine. He could still hear the ghost of the earlier laughter bouncing off the rafters, soft and forgiving. He thought about how quickly anger had turned to understanding, how the same hands that had pointed at him weeks ago were now fitting pieces back together. Maybe that was the real repair, the kind no manual taught, the kind you couldn't sign off on a checklist. Outside the hangar door rattled once in the wind like someone closing a book. Still, the town had one more lesson coming. The morning of the dedication dawned bright and windless, the kind of spring light that made everything in Harrison County seem a little cleaner. The hangar doors were thrown wide and rows of folding chairs faced the stage beneath the restored trainer's wing. The engine gleamed in the sun as if it had been forgiven. From a small speaker near the museum's entrance, a choir recording drifted outward, soft, wavering voices, singing a hymn Frank remembered from base chapel services half a lifetime ago. The notes mingled with the smell of grass and polish, a piece that didn't ask for applause. Mayor Nolan stood at the podium, hat in hand. His tone for once carried no ceremony. "We called this place a museum to preserve history," he said, glancing toward Frank. "But today, we correct a mistake instead." He turned toward the plane and lifted the tarp covering the plaque beneath its nose. The brushed brass caught the light, each word clean and deliberate. He broke his own engine to bring everyone home. For a long breath, no one spoke. The hymn faded, leaving only the echo of a church bell from town and the faint hum of a radio in the museum office. Children broke the silence first, shuffling forward with the cautious awe that comes before understanding. One by one they reached out to trace the engraved letters with small fingers, whispering the words as if learning them by heart. Frank stood back near the hangar wall, cap in hand. He wasn't much for speeches, and the mayor seemed to understand that. Nolan cleared his throat. "Mr. Leary," he said, "on behalf of the town and on behalf of every set of wings that'll stay safe because of you, we owe you more than an apology." Frank smiled faintly. "You already said it right there." He nodded toward the plaque. Evan stepped up beside him, still in his work jacket, eyes glinting under the sunlight. "We're keeping the Leary check as standard," he said quietly. "Every plane, every year." Frank chuckled. "Then maybe I finally fixed something that stays fixed." A small ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, gentle, neighborly, free of tension. The mayor signaled the choir to replay the hymn, this time fading into the hum of a radio broadcast being recorded for the local station. The static came and went like waves against an unseen shore. As the ceremony wound down, Frank walked closer to the plaque. The metal reflected a sliver of sky, a flash of wings, as a flock of birds crossed above. He rested a hand on the edge of the display, the cool surface grounding him in the moment. He looked to Evan, who was explaining the safety check to a group of kids holding paper models. Remember, Evan told them sometimes the experts are wrong, and that's how progress begins. Frank heard the words and smiled once, letting them settle like a benediction. The church bell rang again, echoing through the open hangar. A breeze stirred the flag outside its folds, rippling in time with the distant hum of passing traffic. He took a breath, slow and steady. For the first time it felt like the town's heartbeat matched his own. Then the engines of memory kept running.